Sustainability. It's just a word, but it's a word we're hearing a lot these days, especially connected to agriculture and food. We can all agree that being sustainable is a good thing, but what does that mean anyway? How do you measure it, prove it, and even more importantly, make money doing it? Welcome to Between the Rows. I'm your host, Laura Rance. This week's show takes a closer look at the question of sustainability as it relates to farming. We'll be talking about an industry initiative designed to put Canada's track record into a global perspective. We'll also be talking to one of Canada's largest food processors about how it's investing in the concept and how Canadian farmers risk being left behind. But first, a message from our sponsor.
Your soil has a unique story. At Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture, we get that. Start using precise nutrient information to get optimal crop performance. Try our variable rate program risk-free today. Visit decisivefarming.com. Conditions apply.
This is Between the Rows. I'm your host, Laura Rance. There's a new report out by a coalition of industry, government, and food and environmental NGOs that is promoting the idea of developing a sustainability index for Canada's food value chain. Their report was released just as the Joe Biden administration was moving into the White House. Biden is moving quickly to put America's agricultural sector at the forefront of a strategy to combat climate change and increase its global competitiveness at the same time. According to David McGuinness, the consultant who's been helping the Canadian coalition draft its plan, the U.S. developments put some extra pressure on Canadians to get moving on this front. I started by asking him what the U.S. initiatives could mean for Canada.
Well, what the Americans do is significant for Canada across the board in any case. But what's interesting is that the Americans were actually looking at how to increase production substantially while cutting their environmental footprint. And in fact, by half, by 2050, they set that goal a few years ago. But certainly with this new administration, we're seeing an increased interest in how agriculture and food can become part of a green agenda, a growth agenda, and a response to climate change and sustainability. The fascinating part is while this is and can become quite significant for us here in Canada, this is a global phenomenon. The Europeans, for example, the EU has just launched a new strategy, and it wants to make, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it wants to make European food famous for its sustainability so it could give the EU a competitive advantage. So Canada faces a changing global dynamic where countries are positioning themselves on sustainability. And with the irony is Canada is one of the safest and most sustainable, if not the sustainable agri-food producer anywhere, or second to none. And yet other countries are laying claim to that mantle.
So why isn't Canada claiming its position there?
Well, in fact, we have demonstrated over many years that Canadian protein, plant protein, animal protein has some of the lowest GHG, greenhouse gas emissions. It's highly efficient, and Canada is certainly one of the safest food providers out there. So we have actually stood up, and those credentials and Canada's food reputation is strong here in the country and all over the world. The challenge is that the bar is rising for absolutely everybody as sustainability really does rocket to the top of many agendas in the marketplace, amongst investors and amongst regulators, and increasingly by consumers. And so the burden of proof, the need to demonstrate the proof points, the need to integrate social sustainability, impacts of labor, environmental, climate change, health and nutrition. These things are all of increasing interest. And so what we are finding is that Canada doesn't have an integrated farm-to-fork story to tell that's backed up by proof points and validated globally, so that we can truly lay claim to our sustainability credentials.
So how would that work? I mean, what exactly is a sustainability index, and how does it come into being, I guess?
Well, in fact, that's part of our work, and the group of partners representing a diversity of agri-food system players, that is what we're trying to figure out, and do this in a way that this doesn't become a metrics data chase. It doesn't become a burden, that we are not duplicating any efforts. But how do we roll up this story to show that, for example, that Canadian agriculture is indeed highly sustainable, and inevitably we are making progress on areas where we're not doing so well. And our work has revealed how we can have a better trajectory in order to demonstrate that. So in a way, you're talking about how do you operationalize something as complex as this. That's what our work is all about. What's interesting is that there are a whole number of global indices from academia, from NGOs, from very reputable institutions that have developed indices. And Canada's performance doesn't always look so well. And one of the challenges is that these global indices, looking at sustainability, they're looking at food sustainability and agriculture and comparing countries all over the world. Well, what Brazil does, or what an African country, or a European country for that matter, how they manage their sustainability and their landscapes and seascapes is different than what we do. We're different ecosystems, different soil types, different levels of regulatory and governance issues. So we can't be, it's not really appropriate to have one index compare all. So we need an index that is tailored to the Canadian agri-food context, but linked to a lot of these global goals that everyone is looking at and validated. That's what we're doing, and we're looking at the operational aspects over the next several months.
I'm just trying to think of an example, and I guess one of the differences I can think of is in terms of how animals are raised in livestock production systems between Canada and the U.S., for example. Is that a case in point of where Canada really needs to identify its own benchmarks so that it can differentiate itself in a market on that particular measurement?
Well, there's a number of pieces to this. We actually haven't had the chance yet to look at animal care as part of our work to date, but it's something that we flagged that we need to address over time. But we have to, when we want to differentiate, we have to keep in mind that the Canadian agriculture and food, processed food sector, is really part of an integrated North American and global economy. Ingredients flow across borders that are combined to make the things that we all like to eat, whatever that might be. So we're highly integrated with the global food system. There are common standards for all, food safety, quality, and increasingly on sustainability. So on the one hand, we are working with our competitors and our customers to ensure that the bar is at the right level, that burden of proof is appropriate, that transparency is met. And then on the other hand, countries are positioning themselves to leverage their sustainability credentials and reputation to grow market share. So we have to play in both fields, and we have to do both well. And sometimes that means collaborating with your trading partners, ensuring the right rules of trade are present. And in other cases, we want to win, and we want to grow our market share, and we want to demonstrate that the Canadian food and agricultural sector is second to none. So there are a lot of indicators that can reveal this, and this is our task: is what's the right basket, and how can we validate it in order to be credible?
So I see from your list of organizations and interests that are represented as part of this coalition, very diverse, very broad group of stakeholders. But I'm curious to know how these messages and this importance of this is going to be communicated down to, the farm level, for example, and again, a case in point, the Responsible Grain Initiative, which is somewhat follows along the same line of thinking, although it's a different initiative, has received a certain amount of pushback in the farming community just because of people, A, don't want to have more regulations, more paperwork, more things to watch, and B, they're not necessarily interested in knowing or having the world know if they're not necessarily up to snuff on certain production practices. How do you manage the messaging in that, in emphasizing the importance to growers?
Well, producers are at the very heart of sustainability, how they manage their soil and their landscapes, and how their practices are, they define sustainability, and they're at the heart of this. A number of our coalition partners represent the farm community, and so their voice is pretty important around the table. What we're seeing collectively, and why there was a consensus view around the issuance of our first phase report, is that there is just a recognition that the bar for transparency and disclosure and understanding the materiality of risk is rising for all. And so how do we as a country respond to that and then put our best foot forward? Well, one of the best ways is actually to collaborate and come to the table, which is what this coalition has done so far, and we hope this will continue. Come around the table and understand, really to go through a process of, okay, let's look at the baseline. What are we measuring now? Is this effective? Are we leaving value off the table because our metrics or indicators aren't quite what they could be? And what is the opportunity to better express what we're doing? What's the cost, and what could be the unintended consequences? And so we actually have gone through a couple of case studies to try this out. The case studies, we're sort of dipping our toe into this to make sure that we're doing it right. And what's interesting is that we have come to the conclusion that while producers are certainly doing a lot to manage and steward their landscapes, society cannot ask producers to bear the burden of ecosystem change and responsibility at scale. That's an unfair and unintended consequence that we want to avoid. And so, but by better measuring, for example, nutrient use efficiency, how we manage fertilizers and other nutrients, not only can enhance soil quality, which boosts productivity, and that's good for everybody, including producers, but this can be used to also increase sequestration, which is good to fix carbon in the soil, and that's good for society. So there are some win-win outcomes here by better measuring some of these practices, but we got to do it in a way that ensures that we're doing it smartly and not just creating a data chase.
So David, what's the next steps in this process for your group?
Well, right now we are reaching out. We need to engage more sectors from the farm level up to retail and everyone in between. We need to make sure that the approach we're taking is sound. We need to work on how do we operationalize this. You raised it earlier, which was a very worthwhile question around, how could this work? So we're going to try to get some refinement to this. Plus, what we're doing over the next few months is that we have an opportunity to get greater global visibility for what Canada is doing. The global dialogue, so-called food transformation, is taking place over this year and next as the world increasingly looks to how food is being produced. We believe that if we get our model right, if we can develop a sustainability index that's credible, validated, and speaks to the priorities that the constituents have, maybe we could offer up a model to the world about how to come together and not only take responsibility for what we've done to date, but how do we address changing expectations going forward? I think Canada can win not only on sustainable food production, but we can win in terms of how we present this and be a model to others around the world.
Well, David McGuinness, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for your time.
That was David McGuinness, an Ottawa-based consultant who's been working on Canada's Agri-Food Sustainability Index. Shortly after we talked, a press release from Maple Leaf Foods, one of Canada's largest food processors, popped into my inbox. In case you hadn't noticed, Maple Leaf has been redefining itself. While we might think of it as a company that makes hot dogs, it's pursuing a much higher calling as a carbon-neutral protein supplier. Its new deal with the Boston-based Indigo Ag to buy carbon credits supports that image. I spoke with Tim Favre, Maple Leaf's Vice President of Sustainability and Shared Value, about how that program benefits farmers, but unfortunately not Canadian farmers at this point in time. Here's our conversation about what it's doing and why. Tim, thanks very much for joining us on Between the Rows.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks for having me.
So this was a very interesting announcement this week. What opportunities does Maple Leaf see as a company from aligning with this type of initiative?
Great question. This initiative actually 100% completely aligns with our approach on sustainability and carbon, and actually our social purpose. So back in 2017, we launched Raise the Good in Food, which is the company's purpose. Combined with that purpose is a vision to be the most sustainable protein company on earth. And that's like a guiding light for us. That's a North Star that we're embedding our business priorities to try and reach over time, and a full realization that even what we're working on today might not be considered sustainability a number of years from now. So it's a journey in continuous improvement for us. And this opportunity to invest in regenerative agriculture offsets like Indigo Ag is producing aligns directly to our science-based greenhouse gas emissions targets and our carbon neutral status as being the world's first major carbon neutral food company.
So this is a vehicle that you will use as a company to achieve that carbon neutral status. Is that correct? By buying
Yes, to maintain our status. We're already a net zero company. We achieved carbon neutrality November of 2019, actually.
So, a lot of people would think of Maple Leaf as being a meat processor. And so this redefinition of who you are as a company and what you stand for, I mean, are collaborations like this becoming more important to you in that journey that you describe?
Yes, for sure. I would think that the collaboration all the way up and down the value chain is going to become essential. For food companies, for agriculture companies, consumer product companies, we're pretty similar in that the vast majority, at least of our greenhouse gas emissions impacts, are nestled in the supply chain, right? What we can influence and control by our own operations, our manufacturing facilities, the trucks we have on the road, the electricity we consume is really only about 20% of our overall footprint. Around 80% is our supply chain. So in working with companies like Indigo, working with producers, working with our suppliers is going to be key for us to not only decarbonize, but as well is to try and transform the food system. Right? The food system, I think, is one of the biggest areas of concern when it comes to climate change, but there's also some tremendous opportunities.
So obviously you see as a company a lot of appetite for this in terms of consumer attitudes. Like what is it that's telling you need to move in this direction?
There's some research out there I think it was last year, Angus Reid did a survey. 91% of Canadians expect companies to do their part to protect the environment and reduce carbon emissions. A further 88% think companies should be doing more to protect the environment. I think in general, you could put the food system at the nexus of any of these big societal issues today, on greenhouse gases, on water, on nutrition and health, on animal welfare, on soil health, on food insecurity. Food is definitely interconnected or at the hub of those kinds of issues. And that's what actually drove us to become a purposeful company. Because when you do define a purpose for a company, you explore what's really unique and authentic to your brand or your company and your people. And then what does society need that your company or your brands can fulfill? And that intersection is our purpose. And we've been looking at that and had been looking at that 4 or 5 years ago before we developed our purpose. And then the consumer appetite for sustainability. If we could still go to restaurants today, I'm sure you could walk around the restaurant and many tables would be talking about some of these aspects. That was very prevalent before the pandemic, right? So now it's happening in people's kitchens, but people are still talking about it, and we know consumers are very interested.
So can you walk me through how the mechanics of this program will work, and just sort of how it goes, how it's going to impact or influence the supply chain?
Sure. So we've agreed to a 3-year relationship with Indigo Carbon. Indigo Indigo Carbon has developed a unique carbon market, and it's at scale. That's a really important piece here. They're going to be working with many farmers with hundreds of thousands of acres on crops that they're supporting. So when you talk to folks at Indigo, they describe the farmer's field as a carbon asset, right? That soil is going to hold carbon that is sequestered there by the crops that are planted. And through the adoption of what they call regenerative agriculture practices. These practices aren't new, but over the years, farmers have drifted away from things like no-till farming, use of cover crops, grazing livestock. There's been such a boom on the use of synthetic fertilizers, so reducing that, and crop rotation. So those are kind of like the big 5 of regenerative agriculture practices that can actually, if farmers readopt those or go back to them or start them from scratch, that more carbon will build up in the soil. And the interesting thing about Indigo is that they've developed innovative technology to measure and verify soil carbon through the use of satellite photo imagery and a whole bunch of things and some really sophisticated models that literally what the farmer does is that they can adopt to these practices, and then it's up to Indigo and the team to measure the impact. Now that farmer gets paid per metric ton of carbon that they sequester in their soil, just by changing their practices. So as the model goes, like we're going to be spending $20 a metric ton of carbon sequestered, and that farmer is going to get a significant portion of that $20 direct for every metric ton of carbon that they sequester. And that's pretty game changing. That's pretty new now that technology is a great enabler right across the board.
So I think key here is that they're able to measure it. I guess I'm curious to know how that translates to dollars in the farmer's pocket relative to any additional costs he might incur, either through having to bring in different practices through technology, or perhaps, some would argue there could be reduced yields if they're doing some of these practices. Has that Do you know anything about how the math on that works?
Not the specific details, but we've talked to a lot of farmers along the way through Indigo and through our own relationships. And certainly there may be some costs like investing in cover crops, but the payback time is short with respect to the carbon that can build in the soil. As well, if tilling isn't happening and some of these other practices are adopted, there's a lot of savings on farm by not having to be out on the field with your equipment and whatnot. Fuel savings, those save carbon as well, right? And so what's key is that there's a price on carbon, and Canada has that, right? And farmers can participate in that in a very meaningful way if they can enter into these markets or have the opportunity to enter into them.
So, as this program's currently structured, this is focused on U.S. farmers, as I understand it. Is there an opportunity for Canadian farmers to be part of this?
I'm gonna steal something I read in a recent article that you wrote, Laura, and I wrote it down. I think it was the winds of change are swirling around the role agriculture can play, right, in this mitigating climate change or something like that.
You're
But
throwing my own words back at me, are you?
Yes, but I really like that the winds of change are swirling, because they are swirling. This is so new. It's so innovative. Yes, indigo's only in the United States right now, but I think there's ample opportunity for producers, farmers, and offset developers to take a look at this. But it's not easy, right? Like we've been talking and working with Indigo for over 2 years to get to this announcement state, and Indigo won't have carbon offsets for us to purchase, independently certified and verified offsets until later this year. So it takes a while, and part of the challenges I personally think that Canada has to overcome is that we have a patchwork quilt of carbon pricing across this big, massive country. And that's going to be challenging, not only for buyers like companies like Maple Leaf Foods, because we're going to need to understand and adapt to all these different provincial and potentially even the federal program. And each program may be linked to the provincial regulations. What Indigo's done is aligned with highly credible the voluntary offset market, a voluntary offset market that big jurisdictions in the United States adopt, like California. So the Climate Action Reserve and Verra are two certifications that Indigo has had their methodology approved. And that makes it very, very simple for not only farmers and producers, but for buyers on our side, right? Because every few years, if it's a regulatory offset protocol, that might change with the swirling winds of politics and polarized issues on carbon. And so I think that's a big barrier that we're going to have to overcome in Canada.
Do you think this could change the conversation about carbon pricing in Canada? Right now, farmers look at the federal program and see it as a detriment and something that's going to be a cost to their business. Whereas if you flip that around, they start seeing carbon as an asset. Do you see something like this as coming in and perhaps changing that conversation?
I hope the conversation is still aligned that yes, a price on carbon is important. And with every kind of policy decision like that, there are risks and there are opportunities. I think if the conversation were to be directed in any one way, it would be standardization, harmonization of these programs so that farmers in Manitoba have equal opportunity as farmers in Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, Ontario, Quebec, and everywhere across Canada. It would be a shame that there would be disparate levels of participation right across the board. Whereas in the United States, it might take a different approach, right? I'm a little bit nervous with the new administration. They're going to jump into this 2 feet in, and I don't want Canada to be kind of swept up in the dust, right?
Canada really has to get its act together on this, or it could be left behind.
I can't disagree with you.
Well, thank you very much for bringing me up to date on this, and perhaps we can check in with you a few months down the road and just see how things are unfolding.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for your time.
Okay, take care.
That was Tim Favery, Vice President of Sustainability and Shared Value for Maple Leaf Foods. Our last item this week is an update on the markets with Bruce Burnett, Director of Weather and Markets Information with Glacier FarmMedia. Hi, Bruce. Thanks for joining us today.
It's good to be here.
So, as we know, it's been pretty cold. We're in the middle of a cold spell across the prairies, but you can't say that the markets are cold. They're pretty hot, in fact. What's been going on?
Well, certainly we've seen essentially a lot of buying from international customers, especially China, of all sorts of commodities. And so what that's done is it's resulted in some very tight potential ending stocks for a number of commodities, and that's pushed prices up. We've seen pretty significant appreciation, of course, since harvest, but even in the past month, we've seen values go up considerably, not only for oilseeds, but for grains and pulses as well.
There's been some real surprises in here, and one of them is barley. What's been happening there?
Well, barley, I think, essentially fits into the category where China has been buying a lot of, I would call them alternate feed grains to corn. And in that bucket is sorghum in the US. But for Western Canada, it is barley. And so we've seen very, very strong buying by Chinese customers as well as regular customers, because we also use barley for malting internationally. So the combination of both those things has resulted in some very strong exports through the first half of the year for barley. And basically, if we keep at the current pace, we would run out of barley, and the market would not let that to happen. So prices are going up fairly dramatically.
And of course, canola continues to create some headlines. But I mean, are we at the point where we're starting to ration the demand for it?
I think the jury's still out on that, Laura. Really, we haven't seen any signs of slackening off of demand, both domestically or from export customers for canola. Now, again, we don't have great visibility on this necessarily, so the last move upwards, we'll have to see over let's say, from the middle of February to the middle of March, whether that did impact export shipments any. But right now, we're in the same mode for canola as we are for a number of commodities, where we need to see that export demand decline in the second half of the year here, or we will risk running out of the commodity.
So how's this likely to spill over into the new crop pricing? I mean, are farmers going to be reluctant to price new crop, given the uncertainties around the direction of the markets?
Well, again, if you look at new crop values right now, they look great. And last year at this time, you would be, I would say, salivating over the potential of these types of prices. But now that we've experienced higher prices, I think people are, again, a little bit concerned here. And I think the weather situation on the prairies is playing into that to some extent. We are extremely dry in the prairies right now. We've had some snow in parts of Saskatchewan and Alberta, but basically most of the prairies has very little in the way of subsoil moisture. So I think that's playing in the back of farmers' minds as well, in terms of committing to some new crop pricing.
And of course, the other wild card that's been thrown into this just lately is the rising cost of fertilizer. How do you make that decision when you're looking at fairly dry conditions and a real uptick in what it's going to cost you to fertilize a crop that might not even grow?
Well, yes, it's certainly one of those things where you have to, judge all of not only the potential in terms of price and crop yields here in the fall, but also in what are your input costs going in this year. And I think farmers are going to pay particularly close attention to this. Certainly with fertilizer, we're seeing rapid increases in the price of urea, which again, I don't think is that unexpected given that the US is going to plant a large area of corn this year. But we're seeing increases in both fertilizer, but also in the price of fuel and other things that are essentials for getting this crop planted in the upcoming year.
So, what should farmers be keeping their eye on in the next few weeks for giving some new direction here?
I think the main thing to keep a very close attention to are those new crop bids. Certainly, right now, there's rumors that China has been in buying not only barley but also peas and canola. So, if we see more evidence of that in terms of the prices in new crop positions go up, I certainly think that that's a sign that this demand is here, not only for this crop year, but also well into next crop year as well.
Well, thanks for bringing us up to speed on that, Bruce. We'll be checking in again with you in a few weeks.
Good to talk to you.
Thanks, Bruce. That's all we have for you on this week's Between the Rows, but we'll be back again next week. I hope you'll join us. I'm Laura Rance.
Your soil has a unique story. At Decisive Farming by TELUS Agriculture, we get that. Start using precise nutrient information to get optimal crop performance. Try our variable rate program risk-free today. Visit decisivefarming.com. Conditions apply.
Today's music tracks were Coming Back by Lobo Loco and Earth and Sun, Leading Me On by Derek Clegg, Acoustic Romance and Dusty by Crowander.